I love my Lanshan, and I'm going to show you some modifications that means I fell in love with it as a year-round lightweight backpacking tent. Now these are just my suggestions that I've found and discovered along the way. Take them or leave it, some will work for you and some might not. If you've got anything that you would like to add or suggestions about my suggestions, then just drop me a comment. My tent is a Lanshan 2 with a 4-season inner. But you may find that the things I'm talking about now will apply just as well to the Lanshan 1 or even to the Lanshan Pro. So they're kind of versatile across the family of the Lanshan tents. So the first thing we want to talk about, and the main modification and the most commonly used modification, is to the main guylines. When it arrives from the factory, the tent has a guyline that goes down from the top, from a single point on the top, out to a peg, and then back to a ram's head attachment at the bottom of the doors. But that has many drawbacks, although it's simple. So what I've done is the common modification, where I now have a loop coming from this pull-out point of the vent around to a ring and back up to the top, back up onto the top of the pole. And from that ring, I then have the main guyline going miles and miles and miles down to a peg. So I've made this main guyline about 3 meters long, and there's 2 reasons why I've done that. Firstly, because by lengthening it, the angle of pull is much better. The standard factory guyline pulls down more than it pulls across. By having a long guyline, the direction of pull is much more horizontal, and that helps you to get a much straighter ridge line. The other advantage of a very long main guyline is it gives you much more choice when it comes to where to put your main peg. I use a delta peg at the moment. So there have been times when I've been camping next to a tree, or even on the Cape Path Trail I found a fence near a bothy that was a perfect attachment point, which I could use because I had a very long guyline that would reach that far. So this guyline is 3 millimeter Dyneema, and it's bright yellow because I am constantly tripping over guidelines if I can't see them very clearly. So bright yellow means they stand out and I don't trip over it quite so much. The other benefit of this modification is at the bottom of the door, because I've replaced normally what would be a guyline coming in attaching to the doors with like a ram's head clip. The ram's head clips are very fiddly. They can be prone to breakages as well. So what I've done is to attach loops of bungee to the bottom of the doors, then they go out to a peg. But there's another secret little touch that I've made. Right, so there's a bungee attached to the bottom of each door, but what I've done is to double up the bungee. So basically it passes through the door loop twice. So that gives me a choice. If I've got the tent set low and closer to the ground, I can double the bungees out to the peg. But if I've got the tent set higher, then I can just pull it out, and that gives me a much longer bungee, which will reach if it's further to go to the ground. So by doubling up the bungee, I've got plenty of permutations I can use. You'll also notice there's this clip. Why have you got a clip on the bottom of your bungee, Charles? I'll show you why. Because that clip will go reach across nicely and clip on side guy out points, and that means that the tent door is held nicely out of the way. And I often use that in the morning when I'm drying out the tent and want to open it up to get a nice breeze to blow through it. Just a quick one about the pegs. On all of my pegs, I've added on much longer and thicker lengths of yellow Dyneema. There's several reasons for this. Number one, it just makes it easier to pull the pegs out, because I can get plenty of fingers through the loop to pull out the peg. Second reason is it makes it much easier to find the pegs when you're camping in long grass. It's very easy to lose them, so a nice bright yellow loop is much easier to find. Okay, the next modification we're going to talk about is one that I'm especially pleased with, and it's to do with the direction of pull for the side guylines. Now this is particularly important on Lanshan because the side panel is a especially big area, and if the wind catches the side of it, it's going to push it in towards the inner a lot, so the more stable it is, the better. Now if I come round, if the peg for the side guylines in its normal place, then the direction of pull isn't very horizontal, it's almost downwards and side downwards slope, so the outer doesn't get lifted away from the inner very well. So what I use now are these little short carbon fibre poles. They're 60 centimetres long. I have them made so they go into two sections for easy packing, and at the top there's a little metal ferrule that the guyline can wrap around. And by using those on the guyline, it means that the direction of pull of the tension is a bit upward vertical actually, so you get much better separations and stability in wind. The other thing I've done is to attach, using a temporary clip, a little guyline at the bottom as a dyneema, and that can loop around the bottom of the pole, and that stops the bottom edge of the guyline from flapping around so much as well if it's going to be particularly windy conditions. So used together, those two give a lot of stability and extra strength to the side. Now the guy that used to sell these carbon poles on eBay isn't trading anymore, so I can't offer you much help as to where to get them from, but you can improvise perhaps a part of a section of a pole of an old tent or something like that, but it's well worth considering. The carbon fibre ones of course are particularly light, so the weight penalty is next to nothing. So I've got it on this side, you can see the angle of pull of the guy, and compare that with the angle of pull of the other side where there's no guy, which is downwards. This side is upwards, so it's a much better solution to give stability to the side and give extra space inside the tent. Okay, so just a quickie, talking about the long guy lines that I've used. Now, when we're packing up the tent, they can get really tangled and messed up with the rest of the tent and create havoc when you're trying to unpack ready for a quick pitch. So that's where this bungee comes in, and I'll show you why. So when I'm packing up the tent, what I do is I simply coil up the main guy line, all 3 meters of it, and this little bungee has a cord grip on it, so we can just wrap it round the guy line, cinch it up, and that stops that getting tangled up with anything else. It's never ever been tangled, and it's really easy to undo, so when I come to pitch the tent, I just release the bungee and pull out the guy line. Simple. My next tip is about holding the door open. You can roll it up, and then you use these fiddly little toggles and loops, but it's a bit of a faff, especially in cold weather. I just use a clothes peg. Got quite a beefy one. It's the work of a moment to keep the door open. I got another one for the inner as well. It takes a moment, and they're quite adjustable, and you'd be surprised how many other times I can use them. For example, if I want to hang up some clothes on a guy line to dry them out after a wet day or something like that. Top tip. The next tip is for the pull-out point for the bathtub on the tent. So on the tent there's this grey loop here, and there's also a little attachment point here. Now the tent comes with a loop attached to this to go round underneath the base of the pole. Problem is that if the tent's under tension and you want to take the inner down first, it's virtually impossible to extract that loop from under the pole. So what I've done is attach a bungee, and then these pegs, these clips, the kind of clips that normally attach an inner to poles on a tent that pitches inner first, for example. So you can clip the clip onto the bottom of the walking pole. There we go. And I use the bungee so there's a bit of give and I can tension it up a bit. In that case, it helps to keep the bathtub floor nice and tight, and it means if I want to pack up the inner first, I can just detach the clip. It's quite stiff. There we go. Attach the clip, and I can take the inner down while still leaving the pole in place. Right, now the next thing I want to talk about modification wise is the way that I've attached the footprint and the inner to the outer tension points, and I've changed this a lot over what came supplied from the factory. So the bathtub connects to the outer with this little plastic clip hook. That's as usual, but here is where I've made the changes. So if you have a footprint, which I think makes a lot of sense on a tent like this, and protects the inner, provides durability and extra waterproofing, the footprint comes with its own tie-out points, which are a duplicate almost of the tie-out points for the bottom of the bathtub. So what I've done is to engineer it so that the footprint and the corner of the bathtub basically get pulled out together, and they share a common guy line, which I have also tied on with a bowline loop to the loop of the corner tensioner. So when I pitch the tent, if the inner is already attached, then the bathtub, the footprint are already immediately in the right place and are ready to go up at the same time, and then I can attach them with this little lever, and it can be loosened or tightened just to make sure the fall of the bathtub is correct. So that saves me a lot of time. Now there's many benefits. Number one, it means that the bathtub is always perfectly aligned with the footprint. Because they are attached together quite closely, they are always perfectly positioned. I put a double loop of bungee here just to give it a give, because when you're moving around inside the tent, it can pull and give, so a bit of movement is a good idea. And it also automatically tensions it to reduce creases inside. You'll see there's something else I've done as well. The bathtub is attached using a small carabiner. So, and this means that if I want to take down the inner first or pitch fly first, I can, because this just allows me to detach the inner on its own first. Now if I do that and pitch the tent, then I'm left with a nice shelter already with the footprint attached. So I've got plenty of dry shelter already, and then I can just install the inner on its own and clip it onto the bungee, and we're ready to go. Now that saves me a lot of time and a lot of adjustments and this kind of thing, getting everything lined up perfectly, and it's worked brilliantly for me. Okay, so the poles are set at 110, the fly sheet's nice and low to the ground. Now I've got the inner pulled out to those attachment points to the outer, and so the top of the inner is relatively tight. I've got good separation between the inner and the outer, but the lower half of the inner is a bit more baggy, obviously because there's excess fabric. We're going to look at things we can do to tighten up the inner. So this is the modification that I'm particularly pleased about. If I just zoom in, you can see that now the lower section of the inner is a lot less baggy and is pulled out in a much straighter line, and it's not flapping around so much. If we go into the inside of the inner, I'll show you how I've done it. If I just zoom in on this seam, you can see that the seam is made of two lines of stitches on with a sort of tape, and if I zoom down, you'll see what I've been able to do is to thread a bungee inside that tape on the seam and put a cord grip at the top. The bungee carries all the way down to the bottom in the seam and exits, and there's a cord grip holding it at the bottom. So I've been able to tension this lower half of the seam using a cord, shock cord, inserted in the tape of the seam from this down to there, cord grip at either end, so it's constantly adjustable. So at the moment I've got it cinched up, so that line is now straight, whereas before it was baggy. So I've released the cord grips top and bottom now, so you can see how much flap and play there is in that corner seam. And now that I've cinched up the shock cord, you can see that that seam is tight and straight. So the wall of the inner isn't flapping around at all. The great thing about this mod is that it's cost virtually nothing. Each length of bungee is about 1/2 meter and requires 2 cord grips. So the cost in the extra weight is extremely low, and it means that you can use the Lanshan 2 as a proper 4-season tent, sat nice and low to the ground without the inner flapping around too much. Okay, so now the poles are set at 1, 2, 5, which is more normal standard height. And if I go down, you can see that's creating a really nice big ventilation gap between the fly sheet and the ground. Let's have a look at that corner of the inner. So you can see that edge there is a lot straighter, neater, hasn't got as much movement and is sitting a lot more happily. And the corner of the bathtub is nice and upright and square. Let's have a look inside now. So we're inside the tent now with the height of the poles set at 125, and this is the corner that has the bungee line set in it, and you can see it's sitting nice and straight. I've released the bungees quite a lot because obviously the tent's sitting much higher now. I don't need to cinch it so much. Just for comparison, if we look at the other corner which does not have the bungee in, then you can see that this segment of the seam is sitting a lot more saggy and flappy and round a bit. So compare that with that side that's sitting a lot straighter and neater. Now if the conditions are going to be particularly windy, there is an option to put 2 guys onto the windward side. So I always carry a spare length of about 3 meters of Dyneema with a line lock on it for this possibility, and then that can just be tied on to the loop. I've used a simple bowline to tie on here, or potentially you could tie it onto these attachment points as well for better strength or whatever. But that means that if the wind is variable direction, you've got a bit more of a strength regardless of where the wind's coming from, and a bit more stability. Nearly time to pack it up now. Now the Lanshan comes with a very snug fitting stuff sack, which I found frankly is just way too small, especially if I want to include the footprint. So I've just used a fairly cheap orange stuff sack from Lanshan, and that's a 10-litre stuff sack, and that means I can stuff the whole tent in and it squishes down nicely into my rucksack. But I also carry another one, this blue stuff sack here, and I keep this in case I want to pack the inner separate from the outer. If it's very wet weather when I'm packing up, I will keep the inner dry in its own stuff sack away from the soaking wet outer. Okay, and so my last suggestion is when it comes to packing up the tent when you get home, drying it out and giving it an airing so it doesn't get packed away damp. Luckily I've got a section of fence here at home, and I've put in little hooks up in the corners, and I've can attach the tie-up points to that so that I can hang the tent up sort of sideways and let it dry out in air. And I also find this really useful for checking attachment points and making everything is ship shape and connected properly and everything like that before it gets packed away. Now to add extra strength in the wind and extra sort of guying out points on the fly sheet, I have considered using these toggles halfway up the seam and attaching the line to those. But be warned, you can see that we've added a few extra stitches on this, and that's because these aren't particularly strong, and twice I've had the toggle on the inside pull out. So I don't think that this is a good point to apply much tension or to rely on it for strength, because they are subject to failure. Now I do have a question, and I really welcome any comments. What is this loop for? I suspect it's something to do with attaching the top of the bathtub or keeping it up against the pole, but I've never seen anybody actually using it, so I'd really be interested to know. And here's another puzzle. On the inside of the tent, on the side that doesn't open, we still have these loops attached. On the other side there's a toggle which I hook onto the outer to pull the inner out nicely, but on the inside there's this loop, and I really don't know what it's for. Any suggestions? So there you have it. With these modifications, I think the Lanshan is a pretty good tent for all year round. Partly because of the strength of the walking poles that create the strength. A walking pole is always stronger than any flexible tent pole can ever be. So if the tent's pitched properly, guyed out well, then there's no reason why it can't be quite solid even in the strongest of winds. It's a great tent, isn't it? Right, so that's the end of my suggestions for modifications for the Lanshan. Hope you like them, hope some of them are going to be used to you. If you haven't already, check out my video about how to pitch the Lanshan most effectively. And if you've got any suggestions or thoughts or comments, let me know. Now, I've posted a few videos already, particularly one of me using the Lanshan along the Cape Wrath Trail and also in the Brecon Beacons Dartmoor, and I'll be posting plenty more. So subscribe to the channel and hopefully there'll be more coming your way. Right, that's it for now. Hope you enjoy such a brilliant tent. See you next time.